Sup, bitches?
You're watching Fugitive Red Eye, and welcome to another episode of Media Opinions. I was debating whether to do this as a random thoughts or as a media opinions, but I decided on media opinions, because that is definitely what this is. So, as you can see by the title, today we're going to be talking about why in media, politics is worse than it used to be. And what I mean by that is, there's a common argument you see from retarded people who want to defend slop, who say, if this great movie was released today, you'd have called it woke. Because they don't fundamentally see the various differences between the way messaging and politics and philosophy and all of these things were done in older media versus new media, and why new media is just objectively and demonstrably worse. Now, as I said, there are multiple reasons and facets to this. I'll start out with the one kind of concession I have. There is some truth to the fact that people are more aware of it. That's part of it. People are more aware of the messaging that is in media than they used to be. That's part of it. I'm not going to pretend it's not. For instance, every sitcom has always had, the father be depicted as a bumbling idiot and the mother depicted as, being kind of strong and rational. Propaganda runs deep, so it's always been there to some extent. However, this argument still doesn't hold true because old media was good. Old media did it differently. Again, there are several key differences, and we'll jump into each of those. So let's start with the first, most obvious one. The messaging now is much more in your face. It's much more overt. There's an argument that that's actually a better thing overall societally because people see it and are repulsed by it rather than being subverted by sneaky messaging. Now it's very obvious that the people making these things hate the average person. But nevertheless, that is part of why it's worse. Why it's a worse product. Because they're much more in your face with it, they're much less subtle, much less nuanced. And people take issue when I said the word subtle when referring to King of the Hill, and I'll admit, there's plenty of classic King of the Hill episodes that are unsubtle. But that'll actually lead into another point, which we'll touch on in a minute. But suffice to say, by and large, older media was more subtle and nuanced with its messaging. There was much more fair depictions, there was much more of a understanding of what the other side was saying, and in fact, there was much less hate. Now, the messaging is very hateful of any opposing opinions, it's much less subtle, and it's much more driven to the point where making a good product, a good movie, a good game, a good TV show, or whatever, comes secondary to the message trademark. Let's use South Park as an example for that. I'm actually probably going to be using South Park as an example for a few of these points. But with South Park, the approach, as I've said in many of my videos, to me at least seems to used to have been, current event happens, how does this affect our characters? And so it was still based on the characters in those older episodes. Now, I'd actually argue South Park was far less political before, too. A lot of people will cope and say, no, it always has been. It's it's always had current events to a degree, and it's always had politics and pop culture to a degree. But the approach and the massive amount of it is far different than it used to be. In older South Park, all the best episodes were just them being kids, right? Return of the Fellowship of the Ring to the Two Towers, Professor Chaos, Good Times with Weapons, things like that. None of those had any politics in them whatsoever, but everyone will just blindly say, South Park's always been political. If you don't see that, you're just delusional. Yeah, Cartman gets an anal probe. What's the deeper political meaning of that? Or Volcano, or fucking Scott Tenorman Must Die. What's the political message to that one? Don't fuck with fat people or they'll kill your parents and make you eat them? Is that the political message? This approach to say, oh no, it's always been like that, is fucking retarded and doesn't really hold any water if you look at it. Another issue you run into with a lot of these shows is before, the messaging was far less egregious than it is now. Now, there may have been things that were in your face, obvious and unsubtle with the classic episodes of King of the Hill, or the classic episodes of South Park even. There were messages that were very obvious and in your face at times that were unsubtle. However, the older messaging is far less egregious than what we're seeing now because the Overton window has shifted so much and because progressivism doesn't have any end game and is just change for the sake of change and has gotten to the point where it's just fucking cartoony. For instance, Let's take a classic South Park episode that I don't particularly love, Big Gay Al's Big Gay Boat Ride. The message of the episode is, it's okay to be gay. Now, there's some cringe aspects to even just a message like that, because obviously I'm not the biggest fan of that kind of thing, right? I'm not the biggest fan of homosexuality. But you gotta see how it's okay to be gay is far less egregious of a message of, you must call someone by their pronouns or else you're a bigot, you should be arrested. Children should be able to have all these horrible surgeries that mutilate their bodies and irreparably damage them for life with hormones that also are irreversible and cause damage. Like, there's a key difference in the two messages. There's something very simplistic about a guy likes men, leave him alone. Versus, you must praise people for being for being gay or else you're a bigot. There's a key distinction in those two messages, and South Park understood this with episodes like The Death Camp of Tolerance. It showed just how ridiculous tolerance can be when Mr. Garrison starts acting completely over the top, absurd, and degenerate, and characters freak out at people for not accepting him to the point where even he's like, no, I'm doing this all to be degenerate and to try and get fired. Why the hell are you accepting this? You shouldn't accept this. Tolerance is tolerance, otherwise it'd be called acceptance. You can't just accept all this horrible shit. Even South Park understood that in Season 6. So you gotta see how key different the messaging was versus what the messaging is. It's far more ridiculous now than it was back then. Another thing is, society and tensions were just better before. So, like, for instance, with King of the Hill, part of why that show still holds up, even the very unsubtle episodes, is because it is a time capsule to when the world didn't suck. The world sucks now. There's, like, no cohesion societally. Tensions are at an all-time high. Races hate each other. The two sexes hate each other. Everybody fucking hates each other. And so when you're seeing beloved characters from a show that you look back on fondly because it was before society had really started to be absolute shit, it had already started declining. It's been declining for decades and decades and decades, far before I was even born, right? But before it had reached that point where it was just unbearable, there was still some sort of cohesion. And so to see characters like that from a series that's beloved like that, and put them into today's world where we're depicting the awful fallen world we live in now, we don't need to see that. I don't need to see what Hank Hill thinks of the Trump presidency. I don't need to see what Hank Hill thinks of transgender bathrooms. From what I've heard, too, I haven't actually watched the King of the Hill reboot. As you may know, I watched the trailer, and I looked at some fucking promotional art. From what I've heard from people who have watched it, is the show itself doesn't actually really take any stands on anything either. It just kinda uses modern politics as a set piece to say, look guys, we're acknowledging this modern thing exists. The older King of the Hill episodes were saying something. And even if I didn't vibe with every message it was saying, it had a point to be made, and it also understood the other side. Now, everything is either one-sided, completely unnuanced, completely unintelligently made as a decision, like it's just completely visceral, or it's saying nothing and just saying, look guys, this thing exists now, isn't that crazy? We know this thing exists, look, it exists. A lot of media does that too, where they just shove it in your face just to remind you, yes, this exists. And again, also, it's the intention. Before, although there's always been a propagandistic aspect to media, there were genuine writers that didn't hate you just for being like a straight white male. There were writers that didn't hate you back before. Now, it's like every writer hates you, and they want you to know it. If you're not a fucking minority, or you're not a homosexual, or you're not all these different little check boxes they can put you in, they want you to know they hate you, and you are the problem. It's much more hostile than it used to be. Before, even when shows would criticize people and things that I agree with, there wasn't as much fucking vitriol with it. There was far more of a feeling of, they disagree, they think we're misguided, that kind of thing. Now it's like, no, you're evil, I hate you, and I want you gone. That's the key difference as well. These things are not the same. These are not equivalences. So people who act like, oh, all these shows and movies that were great in the past, if they got released now, you'd call them woke. No. Things are done very differently. These things are not equal. You can draw certain parallels because, again, the propaganda has always been there to a point. And you can also look at things very, very surface level. But the point is these things are different. For instance, people will use race swapping as an example, right? Like, when they put, like, a black character in a white role, traditionally, they'll call you a bigot if you don't like that. But the problem isn't even just that they're race swapping. It's that the reason for it is strictly to do the message. It's strictly to kind of rage bait and to push a specific type of propaganda. It's not like, because there's plenty of race swaps in the past that have been fine, even in more modern times. For instance, Nick Fury being Samuel L. Jackson, literally nobody had a problem with that. The problem isn't just that either. It's also the double standard. Like, I know just acknowledging a double standard at this point is a cliche, because let's face it, these people don't actually have consistent beliefs or standards, so to point out the double standard doesn't really have a purpose, but it's fucking there. And you see stuff like that Korean guy, ProZD, who was like chimping out about how we need to have authentic voice acting in cartoons. Because the other thing is it doesn't go both ways. These people want race swapping to be allowed for any minority to take a white role, or even to take other minority roles. But the second it happens the other way around, where a white guy is voicing any non-white character, they chimp out. And then this guy got a taste of his own medicine because he pushed so hard for authentic acting, and then got upset that he was only getting Asian roles. Like, you reap what you sow, motherfucker. But our standards have shifted so much, goalposts have changed, that it's just undeniable how different the messaging is. We have an entirely different culture now than we did even just 10 years ago. There's plenty of things now that you see where everybody has to pretend that they take up some sort of moral cause, or that they're outraged because there was this edgy joke or that edgy joke in previous media. And again, this whole concept of saying, oh, you would have hated this if it came out today, is not at all an accurate statement, because, again, if it came out exactly as it was, it wouldn't have the problems our modern media has. Now, there may be some people who nowadays are so tired of a lot of these cliches, tropes, and just shit being shoved down your throat, that you could make the argument some things people might say, oh, on a very, very surface level, but the problem is, that's not most people. Most people would not do that. The thing is, things are just so radically worse now with the way that stories are told, with the way that characters are written. Everything is bad now because it all takes a back seat for the narrative trademark. It's not the same, and to pretend that just because something has a surface level resemblance in some way, that somehow people would have the same opinion, just shows your own lack of fucking intelligence. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this very ranty media opinions. I hope I got all my points across that I was trying to do here. Anyway, this has been Fugitive Red Eye. You have a good one. Toodles.
You take forever to say nothing.
Subscribe to Fugitive Red Eye.